Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining this Bytes webinar on our disaster recovery as a service. Essentially going to take you through the service itself, some of the reasons why other customers are looking at these types of services. But before I kind of kick off our position where this service sits within the Bytes Managed Services portfolio. So Bytes has been developing its managed services offering, working predominantly through partners to deliver a holistic approach to managed services. So how we kind of present it is we have the connectivity, voice and hosting solutions, that's MPLS, VPLS, hosted voice, cloud voice, SIP, and your standard kind of colo services that we can offer. Above that, we have our infrastructure and resiliency services. So this is where the DRaaS service actually sits, and our BAS service as well, our backup as a service. And also, if customers are looking at straightforward IaaS services or even public cloud infrastructure services, we can support them on that. Above that, we have our SaaS, so Office 365 being the most common one, our app optimization and management services. So this is where clients are moving to public cloud and they need some support in transforming their workloads so they work most efficiently on the public cloud. And we support the migration and management and support over that. Everything we do has 24/7 support and management, and threaded throughout everything we offer. Obviously, network and data security is particularly key, particularly with the regulations at the moment everyone has to adhere to. So jumping straight in, I'm going to cover off our disaster recovery as a service. So typically, a lot of organizations think of disaster recovery as only really being needed when there's a major failure, such as a major power outage or there's an earthquake or something else. But in reality, most of the actual failures as a result of accidental human error, and more recently and on the rise is cybercrime, and more specifically the ransomware attacks, where organizations of all sizes across all sectors are being targeted from all over the world. And we'll cover off a little bit how this disaster recovery service can help against those types of services as we move on. So typical data protection services, and I'm sure many of the people on the call have these in place. They'll have a backup, which is done every 24 hours. So in the event of a major disaster or an issue where they had to restore, they restore from one of their latest backup, which obviously could mean 24 hours loss of data, and obviously all the time to build and recover that infrastructure. More and more organizations are doing snapshots, which can obviously limit that loss of data down to 4 hours, maybe 2, depending on the overhead your back-end infrastructure can take with the snapshots, because obviously it does take its toll on the actual infrastructure itself. But both solutions do equal data loss and obviously downtime in terms of when you're trying to recover. So the solution that we're talking about today essentially aims to minimize that impact by taking thousands of recovery points over a 30-day period, and you can rewind to any of those recovery points at any point in time within a couple of seconds. So the power of that is essentially, if you did have, for example, a ransomware attack, and you did know roughly when you were actually infected, you could recover to a point a few minutes or seconds before that attack took place, and recover that into your DR site and be up and running very quickly with very little loss of data. And this can apply to full sites, just single apps or VMs or even files you can recover, because the technology itself isn't a snapshot technology, which I'll go into a bit more detail as we move on. So this is the dashboard of the actual service itself. So as you can see, the software we use is called Zerto, And this is the dashboard that our customers would typically view, giving them an indication of what's going on with their DR service. This obviously dashboard and the infrastructure that sits behind it sits on the DR side, so it's still available in the event that you lost your production sites. You still have visibility and access to this. This is iPad or tablet optimized and phone optimized as well, so you can view and explore the information remotely wherever you are at any point in time. Just going across the top, you have this terminology called VPG, which is essentially a virtual private group, and it's essentially a group of servers, and that's the way Zerto breaks down the infrastructure in terms of priority of it failing over. So you obviously create a run book and you prioritize your applications that need to come up first and foremost, in the order in which you want them to come up. And a VPG could be, for example, an Exchange environment or an app environment with a database. So it's a group of servers that need to come up at the same time to work together. Next to that number, you've got number of VMs within those VPGs. So in this example, you have 124, amount of data that's protected. The average RPO, which is showing 7 seconds, we typically see in the real world between 10 and 30 seconds recovery point objectives, which is still generally a lot better than most organizations. There's lots of parameters that factor into that: size of infrastructure, data change rate, connectivity from the production site into the DR site. Some customers opt for a direct connect tail off their MPLS if they're coming into one of our data centers, or express route if it's going into Azure. Others go over VPN, which is, again, you can still achieve very low RPOs. And on the right hand side, you've got the compression rate that's being achieved on that data. There's also WAN acceleration and compression from the production site as well, and you can also time in terms of time how much bandwidth is utilized coming from the production site, so you don't max out anything during key periods, busy periods during the day. On the left hand side, you've got some more stats around the actual service, around IOPS throughput and WAN traffic. At the bottom, you've got a site topology. So this service can do many-to-many clouds. So if you have multiple production sites and you want to be DR'd to a single site, or you may want to do production site, your core applications to a more traditional data center, but then you might want to put your web services into Azure or AWS. You can do that. So it's got that capability of multi-cloud recovery to a single point or multiple points. So what we're going to do now is just kind of simulate a disaster recovery situation where you lose your production site. So on your dashboard, obviously replication has stopped, and therefore you cannot continue to use your production site. So everything goes red. Bottom right hand corner here, you've got two options. You either do a live failover or a test failover. So the good thing about this service is you can opt for test, obviously not if it's a real DR scenario, but in the event that you're just testing this, you can just flick that switch to test and it will simulate a failover with no impact to production and give you a really nice, clean compliance report at the end of it, showing you how well you would have done in the event that you had done that in a real life scenario. But in this example, we're going to do a live failover, so that the switch is hit to live. Then essentially you choose which applications that you're looking to actually fail over. And obviously in certain situations, you may not want to fail over everything. It may be just a key application that's been corrupted or compromised, and you need to fail over that particular. Then you verify the apps that you've chosen. You can see on this example, there's some workloads within AWS. Then you choose the points. So up here, you've got select VPG recovery point for the failover test. Most common, probably latest, because you want to be most up to date. You don't want to lose any data, so you want to get that RPO as low as possible, but you may actually have a journal point down here that's more relevant to what you require. And you can actually see on this example how many journal points there are and how much options you have in terms of picking a point in time of when you actually recover to. And then you click failover. So it is pretty much simple as that. I think it's around 3 or 4 clicks from having the event to actually starting the failover. And once you click that, the infrastructure will then start to be spun up in the DR site, and you can start logging onto those servers into the DR site, moving DNS across, ensuring that the connectivity and VPNs are all coming up as well from that perspective. So it is a very kind of straightforward service from that perspective. As I mentioned earlier, if you did do a test or a true failover, it does give you this compliance report, which in terms for regulatory compliance is really useful. We see a lot of customers buying services purely just on this basis because they can give it to their insurance companies, they can show their customers. We have heard some organizations using this for their GDPR, kind of showing that they're using everything, belts and braces, so they can recover from a major failure, so they can get that data back. That's kind of the GDPR kind of skew on it. But we are seeing more and more customers wanting to prove that they can actually test their DR, as opposed to just saying, yeah, we've got a DR business continuity in place, but not actually being able to really prove it. Whereas this service does enable you to do that. So now we're going to dip into essentially how it all sits together within the actual infrastructure. So you've got 2 sites here. As I mentioned, you could have multiple sites, but in this example, we've got 2. So you've got your production site, and then you've got your business continuity as your DRaaS replication site. So from our perspective, we've got several data centers in the UK, and you can replicate that. That's on a vCenter platform, or you can go to our Azure estate or AWS, or you can actually use your own Azure or AWS services as well, and we can manage that on your behalf. So there's quite a lot of flexibility in terms of where you fail across to. In terms of infrastructure deployment on your premise, there's something called a Zerto virtual manager that plugs into your vCenter or Hypervisor or Hyper-V if you're using Microsoft. That will obviously communicate with the DR site, and then we have what we call VRAs, which is essentially your virtual replication appliance. You need one of these per physical host. They're very, very small in terms of footprint and what's required, but these essentially look at exactly what's happening within those hosts, look at those VMs, and they replicate at block level the changes, which enables this near sync replication and RPOs of seconds. So that's critical in terms of how the service works. As I mentioned, the client itself does allow for compression and throttling in terms of minimizing the impact on your internet and bandwidth between sites. In terms of back-end infrastructure, the technology is agnostic. It doesn't care essentially what you've got sitting. It just looks at the VM and looks at the storage LUNs that are attached to those VMs, and that's what it monitors for changes, and then it replicates those changes at block level across to the DR site. So once you've done the initial seed, again, bandwidth utilization is a lot less, and with the compression and throttling and everything else that the technology does, it does actually have a relatively low impact compared to some technologies that are doing big snapshots up and down your pipes. So this slide essentially just gives you a bit of an overview of why you potentially go for a service as opposed to a on-prem type solution. So I'd say almost 50%, 60% of the opportunities that we get to discuss with our customers are around them having a DR site at the moment, or having some element of resiliency between offices and they're looking to either replace that infrastructure in the DR site or shut that site down, mothball it, and then do something else that actually potentially works. So there is this ability to kind of reserve those costs of managing a secondary site, managing all the infrastructure, managing power, cooling, of something that doesn't really work necessarily, or it doesn't actually get used that much either. Whereas the service that we obviously provide is you pay for the actual service, but you only really pay for what you use of that service. In essence, when you fail over and use it, you pay for the days that you're using it. You don't pay it for the whole year, which you would do with your own infrastructure, which is pretty obviously key when you have a DR service. You don't necessarily want to pay for it. This obviously maps very nicely into public cloud services where you're replicating the storage, and obviously you've got your VPN costs and the small amount of infrastructure that sits within the public cloud. But beyond that, you don't pay a penny unless you actually need to use that DR environment. However, we are seeing organizations use these services for test and dev purposes now, because it is so easy to do a test failover. They will test and failover an application, apply a patch to it, maybe do an upgrade to it, and just see how it performs, and then shut it down, and then do that on their production environment. So they are using it as a sandbox environment, almost for testing as well. Which is a key part of this service and this offering as well. So just a summary of the managed service wrap around this particular offering. As I mentioned, in the event that you do have a DR scenario, you can just pick up the phone. You can obviously use the portal to invoke yourself. During the build and setup of these services, the engineers will work through the run book, so we know exactly what services are going to come up. You do have the ability to run always-on services within the DR data center as well. So lots of customers of any significant size will have an AD, for example, running, or an Exchange DAG, and using the kind of inherent sync replication within those technologies, as opposed to using the Zerto software to replicate those. That just aids the time in which you can recover your recovery time objectives. Obviously, the entire service is proactively monitored with reports coming out in terms of your RPOs that you're achieving, your average RPOs, your RTOs. If we see any issues with the service or SLAs dip below where they should be, then we'll proactively contact you. Various reasons could affect this. Most common one is organizations forget they have a DR service and then rip out a host and don't let the engineering team know that. So obviously we get an alert saying that host is not there anymore, it's not replicating. We need to get the virtual replication appliance back on the new host that's replaced that host. So those are the kind of typical services that we'll pick up on. In terms of a P1, we give an SLA of 15 minutes in terms of making sure somebody's on it and working with you, which is obviously again critical in the event of a major DR event where you are looking to bring up your infrastructure in the DR site. The last thing you want to do is kind of focus on maybe the technology and the service that's being delivered. You just want to pick up the phone and say go, and the service essentially has been all brought up, whilst you focus on the applications, the rest of the IT, the rest of the business that needs to access that IT, knowing that the actual core infrastructure is being brought up in the DR environment. All the services that Bytes offer obviously have to be audited by the vendors that we use. So Zerto will audit the service, make sure we're on the latest version, make sure we've got it patched and up to date. So it gives you kind of peace of mind in terms of that the platform is where it needs to be. As you'd expect, ISO 27001, the data centers we use are tier 3 data centers, so there's no single point of failure, with PCI SOC, HIPAA-SEC as part of it. So typically mirror whatever the customers or clients regulations compliance need to be. And as with all these services, GDPR comes into it, and we've got all the right statements and collateral and contracts that again mirror what you're trying to do with your customers to when you look to outsource anything with regard to data. Obviously contracts come into it, so we ensure that our contracts are back to back in terms of what you need them to be to deliver those services. So that's the end of the kind of webinar. So what I think we'll do now is look at see in terms of questions.
Yeah, if you do have any questions, there is a questions box just at the side. So just pop those in there and I will read them out for you. Do you want to just change it back to...
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions. So first one is quite a common one, is how is the service actually priced? So the service is priced differently depending on what you want. So if it's a standard kind of DR to one of our data centers, it's very, very straightforward. It's essentially number of VMs, the amount of storage that's going to be replicated, and the spec of those VMs, so the CPU and memory of each of those VMs. And then we can give you a price. We typically bundle an amount of test dev and failover days, anything from 5 days, 7 days to 14 days, depending on your requirement. And then you can either pay monthly or quarterly or annually for the service itself. If it's public cloud, it's slightly different, because obviously some customers would either like to use their own public cloud, so then they have their own kind of infrastructure costs, and then there's just a per VM management cost from our perspective. But we will also estimate all the costs within Azure or Amazon if that's the target that we're failing over to, or you can fail over to our Azure tenancy or Amazon tenancy. It would obviously be a subscription dedicated to the client itself. It's not shared, but again, that will include all the pricing for Azure or AWS service. So another question is coming: is there a limit to the amount of VMs that can be replicated concurrently? No, there's no real limit. I mean, there is a limit. I would say, I think the last conference I went to, they were talking about 20,000 VMs. I think they've got a bank that Zerto work with directly that are pushing the boundaries of that. But generally, no, there isn't. Within the public cloud domain, the more VMs that you're replicating, the more virtual cloud appliances you require. That's more for performance reasons, and you can apply one per 50 VMs. But at this stage, Zerto haven't really said there's a major kind of cap to it, so not too much. Another question: what are the common pitfalls when starting out with Zerto? I think the biggest thing we find with customers are organizations don't actually necessarily really focus on the connectivity element and how they're going to access the resources. I mean, Zerto is essentially a replication software, which is great, and it does all the orchestration and automation of bringing up the VMs into the site, and it has a really nice, clean, GUI dashboard that you can use. But that's all irrelevant if you can't actually access that environment cleanly and with low impact to the end users, who obviously need to use and consume these services. So what we typically find is organizations getting on relatively well with how the Zerto software works, but not really considering the connectivity aspect of it. Our engineers are actually all have the background of networking, because we find that's the most major area that we need to focus on when getting these services up and running. We also allow a lot of flexibility in terms of connectivity to the environment, particularly in our own data centers, where many customers will drop an MPLS tail into the environment. So we're essentially just a spoke on their MPLS network. And also we provide checkpoint firewalling dedicated for the customer, which enables them to either fully control that firewall themselves, so they can apply the rules as they apply their own rules, or have it fully managed. Obviously VPN clients can then be applied to that. They can have IDS and IPS if security is a big concern for them as well. is this managed service within the UK only? So the managed service is run exclusively from the UK, but with the advent of obviously public cloud, we do have some customers replicating in regions. So they may have, for example, a Hong Kong office with some production environment, and they would need a DRaaS service to a data center in their region. We would typically use Azure for this, or anywhere else in the world. But the actual managed service is managed by UK individuals. So is there any orchestration controls within the application for re-IPing as VMs are failed over? Also to application aware, iSQL, SAP. So yes to both of those. So the way we typically manage this is when you're actually building out the runbook and the DR service itself, we do typically mirror the IP address ranges that you've currently got. Again, it just aids in terms of bringing these services up and not overcomplicating it. But that's all done within the software itself in terms of how it orchestrates it. It brings up the VM, it applies the IP, applies the VLAN, everything else gets brought up in a nice way. So it just works when it comes up. So, and it is obviously application SQL, Oracle aware. There is some great white papers which I will share following this call to everybody on the call around how it does that. It's kind of a technical level above myself, but it does it quite eloquently in how it interfaces with those types of application. Is there a roadmap to support IBM, Google Cloud, or is it just AWS, Azure, and Azure? There's still a long way to go on AWS and Azure because AWS and Azure are obviously the main players in this space. That's where their energies have been focused on, and it is a lot of work to interface with all the relevant APIs, all the different services that these public cloud providers are taking. So what the approach Zerto have kind of have done is they've focused on the pain points really, as opposed to trying to spread themselves too thinly, which as a service provider we've kind of encouraged. Most of our customers are either AWS focused or Azure focused or traditional cloud focused, but on the roadmap I suspect there will be cloud to cloud, multiple clouds coming in as Google starts to become more of a powerhouse within this space. I suspect they will also start looking at those guys. So another question: do you support IBM Unix VM? I'll come back to you on that one. Not 100% sure. It obviously supports VMware, Hyper-V, and the hypervisors within Azure and AWS. Not sure on that one, Lance. I'll find out and get back to you on that one. Just check and see if there's any other questions coming in. Okay, one last question was, can we use our own Azure to replicate but still have a managed service? Yeah, I mean, if you've got an appetite to kind of have this on your own Azure tenancy, we've got a client we're working with at the moment that's requested that. We essentially estimate what their cost for hosting the infrastructure is on Azure, give that to them so they know that, they can budget that, and then we just give them a cost for the actual managed services itself, which includes the license, the management, and monitoring of the actual service and support. So that's absolutely no issues whatsoever. Brilliant. I think that's another question just come in, which I'm definitely going to have to get back to you around. Does it support VMware integrated containers or containers in general? I believe so, but it's one I'll email the group with following this call. But yeah, I think that's everything, Amy.
Lovely, thanks, Simon. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all the
problem.
questions as well. As mentioned before, I'll send you all a link to the recording so this afternoon or tomorrow morning, and then also Simon mentioned some white papers, so we'll include those as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Simon, for presenting.